Welcome to the Reading Nook. So here in this little segment on my channel is the Reading Nook, where we are reading A Cat's Chance in Hell by Sharon Hannaford at this moment in time. So make sure you've got your drinks and you're good to go. Without choking on your drinks, of course. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of the canvases that we've worked on so far, and all details of current projects are in the comment section below. Big shout out to Sharon Hannaford. Thank you so much for giving me your permission to read this on my channel. It's been great fun, especially the accents. I'm so sorry. As you saw at the start as well, there's a warning. It's for mature audiences, so please, no kids. But other than that, I hope you enjoy. Bye!
Chapter 20. She poured herself a cup of coffee and took the empty seat next to Kyle at the large oval conference table. He gave her a quick, assessing grin. "I hear you tore it up at the obstacle course today," he whispered. "Fastest time on record." He nudged her with his elbow teasingly. "I didn't know anyone was watching or timing it," she hissed back in annoyance. Byron cleared his throat, preventing further discussion. "As you all know, Irene came to us with some urgent information from the Magi Council this morning," he said without preamble. He stapled his hands in front of him on the mahogany table. Gabby thought he looked troubled, but determined. Whatever was coming was bad but not insurmountable. Athena was watching the rest of them rather than Byron, so apparently she had heard the news already. Gabby supposed that, as one of the high councillors for the Magi Council, she had been privy to information before Byron was. She wondered why Athena hadn't been the one to bring them the news. It seemed odd that the older Magus had come into the offices to tell Byron. Byron continued. "One of the oracles had a vision this morning, and it seems to be related directly to our current situation. There was a collective intake of surprised breaths. The oracles were a trio of Magi Council's most powerful clairvoyants. Their true identities were closely guarded secret, more closely guarded than Byron's was. When they had a clairvoyant vision, it was invariably accurate, as long as it had been interpreted correctly. They also had an uncanny knack for knowing what to do in order to alter the outcome of a vision. Of course, it was frequently impossible to interpret their visions. Many of them were hopelessly obscure, and often, by the time the meaning of the visions became clear, it was too late to do anything about them. To the oracle's credit, they did manage to help prevent dozens of catastrophes, both minor and major, each year. None of them had any control over what they saw and couldn't be asked to look for something specific. It was theorized that if they meditated over a particular subject, they would get some kind of insight on the subject. But there was no way to ensure it was the insight that they wanted. Many of their visions were not about bad or dangerous events. Many were not warnings at all, just glimpses of the future, sometimes happy and bright. There was a team of Magi who spent their days trying to work out what the visions actually meant, and if they required any action to be taken. They have seen what Dante and Mariska are planning and when they plan to do it, Byron continued. Athena, you could probably explain this better than I can. Why don't you continue? She nodded curtly and stood up to address the rest of them. The visions were unusually clear, so we've been able to decipher them relatively easily. From what the visions have shown us, Mariska has been declared maleficus. Gabby felt her eyebrows shoot up in astonishment, and saw confusion on the faces of the others. It seemed she was the only one of the hunters who knew what this meant. Athena seemed to realize she'd lost most of them, so she impatiently explained. Maleficence essentially means criminal magus. It's extremely rare for one of us to be labelled so. It's not done lightly. Even those who are dark magi are not often branded as such. It means instant death on capture. The trial has already been held, and the magus has already been found guilty of evil deeds. Now it's only a matter of catching up with her to mete out the punishment. She paused to allow this news to sink in and for the murmurs of surprise to die down. Summer solstice is almost upon us, she continued. And this year will be a particularly powerful day and night as it coincides with the full lunar eclipse. The ley lines will be overflowing with power. Almost any magic would be possible on a night like this. Mariska and Dante are going to be harnessing this unusual potent force to try and open a permanent gateway through the void, allowing demons an unobstructed pathway to our city. Athena's eyes were brimming with suppressed fury. She jabbed a finger on the table. The oracles say they will get this right. that Mariska has enough ability and has found the right spells to do it. Unless we can find a way to stop them. She almost growled the last sentence, when her voice dropped to a whisper. We have to find a way to stop them. She dropped back into her chair, seeming exhausted by the prospect. Gabby found she had no patience with the annoying woman. They had work to do, things to plan out, information to find. Sitting in a sorry-for-yourself heap wasn't going to get them anywhere. So when exactly is the summer solstice this year? She asked the magus irritably. And did the oracles have any idea where to find Mariska or Dante, or how we could stop them? At Gabby's sharp words, Athena tried to pull herself together, sitting up straighter and flicking her hair back. 4 days' time, and no, they don't have any clues where the vampire or Maleficus are hiding out, Athena answered tonelessly. The best way to stop them is to capture Mariska or kill the Demon Master. Mariska cannot control demons, so she wouldn't open the gateway if he wasn't there to control them. I'm assuming the Demon Master is Dante? Athena nodded curtly. So the long and short of it is that we have less than 100 hours to find them and put a stop to all of this, Gabby summarized, when no one else seemed capable of speech. Where do we even start? Matt asked in a voice that spoke of the sheer enormity of the task. We start with the only direct link we have to them, Lance spoke up, steely determination in his tone. The warehouse and the humans left behind in the ghoul hole. There has to be a clue somewhere in that place. You're right, Doug spoke up now. It's the only lead we have. I agree, Byron said, nodding. We need to get everyone we can spare out there. He turned to Athena. Magi would be particularly helpful there, especially diviners or clairvoyants. Anyone who could pick up on psychic energy or life force. Maybe we can pick up some idea of where they've set up base. Athena's natural business-like attitude kicked in. Yes, of course, she replied. I'll contact Irene and coordinate to have everyone we have available to join us at the warehouse. I'll be there myself as well, as soon as I've made the arrangements. She stood and briskly left the room. Doug, will you collect one of the trainees and head to the warehouse as well? Byron asked. We may need your expertise in case any of the humans have turned. Take a couple of flamethrowers with you. Though he sounded brisk and detached, Gabby could see how much the thought of having to take human lives was affecting Byron. He took a deep breath to steady himself. I'll contact the werewolf pack leaders and ask if they can spare some additional muscle. Doug nodded in agreement and left the room. Lance, Matt, I need the two of you to go home and get some rest. Byron put a hand up at their immediate protest. I'll need you tonight. We've seen what can come at us in the dark. We'll use the daylight to do our investigations, gather information. And at night we need to have as many as possible fresh and ready to take down whatever is sent our way. So go home, rest, recharge, and report back here before sunset. They reluctantly agreed and departed for home, after Byron assured them he'd call if anything happened during the day. We going to head out there too? Carl asked when just the three of them remained in the room. Byron ignored the question. I would prefer the two of you went home to rest as well, but I know better, Byron said with a rueful attempt at a smile. You can go and help for a while at the warehouse if you both promise me that you'll take time off for a few hours this afternoon. I need you both at your best tonight. As it turned out, Gabby found it easier than she anticipated to go home for a catnap after lunch. She felt relatively useless at the warehouse. The Magi were doing the most good. Healers trying to help the humans, mediums trying to catch the spirits of the dead, clairvoyants trying to pick up any traces of energy, and Athena concentrating on tracing the source of the impressive wards that had hidden the place from psychic sight. Another two humans had turned into ghouls, and Gabby was secretly relieved that they had already been dispatched by Doug when she'd arrived. It looked as though the rest of the humans would pull through without turning. At least, that's what they've been telling themselves. Byron had arranged secure and far more humane facilities for the remainder of the humans, and the first task of the evening would be for Gabby, Carl, and whatever vampires Judas could spare to transport the pitiful bunch to the new facilities, where they could be monitored and cared for. After that, they'd be splitting into 3 groups with a mix of SMV staff and vampires for a patrol through areas where strong ley line convergencies occurred. As there was still a fairly large cloud of suspicion and animosity surrounding the inclusion of the vampires in the patrols, it was decided that a referee would be needed in each group. Carl would go with one group and Gabby with another. Lance had worked with the vampires the previous night and didn't seem to have any problems with them, so he was their natural choice to lead up the third. Matt could take his pick of the groups to join. Gabby knew this would be her time to make a contribution, and not wandering around the warehouse during daylight hours pretending to know what she was looking for, so she and Carl drove back to her house for a nap until sunset. Gabby texted Julius before going to sleep, asking him to meet her at the warehouse with as many of his guard as he could spare. His reply woke her just before dusk. He and his guard would meet them at the warehouse at 8 p.m. She rose stretching, still enjoying the absence of pain, and went to kick the guest bedroom door, rousing Kyle. As she changed into fighting gear, she wondered how long her new speed and strength would last, if it would disappear in slow increments or vanish abruptly. She sincerely hoped it wouldn't vanish in the middle of battle. That could prove disastrous. The two of them stopped at a burger place to fuel up on the way. Gabby caught the nervous stares that were being directed their way and had to suppress a grimace. She glared at the diners, thinking that they were lucky she decided to remove her knives and swords before walking in. Still, at least they weren't going to be harassed by anyone. The heart rate, which Gabby could hear quite clearly from the freckled-faced teen who was serving them, ramped up to dangerous speed as he stammeringly confirmed the order and took the cash Gabby held out to him. He dropped the change onto the counter and looked up with nervous eyes as he stuttered his apology. Gabby rolled her eyes as Carl tried not to snicker. "I told you we should have just used the drive-through," she grumbled, briskly scooping up the scattered money and going to sit in the vacant table in a dimly lit corner, leaving Carl to collect the tray of food and drinks. When the food arrived, Gabby found she was hungry, though still not as starving as she normally would be. She actually had to make an effort to finish the 3 burgers and extra large fries. Carl was contemplating her lack of appetite a few hours later, while sitting holed up in one of the 3 secured vans supporting the wretched-looking humans. Facilities had been set up for them in an abandoned mental asylum in the outskirts of the city. He had been earmarked for demolition in a few months' time, but was still mostly functional at the moment. Byron never ceased to amaze Carl in his ability to source absolutely anything. Between Byron, Irene and Ian, they'd set everything up in less than 24 hours. His vampire companion for the journey had surprised him. Somehow he'd ended up in a van with Julius, though he assumed that it was because Carl chose the lead on the van that contained the woman who tried to attack Gabby. Obviously, neither of them were prepared to let Gabby anywhere near the woman again. He'd seen the loaded looks being traded back and forth between Gabby and Julius, and had assumed Julius would take the first opportunity to get Gabby alone. But instead, as the hunters each chose a van to guard, Julius had joined Carl, Alexander had teamed up with Gabby, and Fergus had eagerly joined Lance. As there were only space for 2 guards inside each van, the rest of them were following in separate vehicles. 2 of these assigned to each van in case of trouble. The driver of the van sat in a separate cubicle, completely protected by thickly armoured plated steel. The steel was embedded with silver, as the vans were frequently used for bringing in renegade werewolves. The only communication Carl and Julius had with Rory, the werewolf driver, was by intercom. Julius and Carl were in small cramped seats in separate barred area at the front of the van, which afforded them a clear view of the grieving mother and another male huddled in separate heaps on the floor in the rear of the van. Carl didn't foresee any problems with the male. He was so scared as to be almost catatonic. He hoped the Magi would be able to ease the horrors of the past few days if they didn't turn, but he secretly thought it was a vain hope. Nobody could go through what they've just been through and walk away unscathed, and no one would give the woman back her dead daughter. Of course, first they had to stay human. Carl tried to shake himself out of his morose thoughts and turned to study Julius instead. He assumed that Gabby and Julius had got down and dirty the previous night. He was pretty sure Gabby would have discussed anything else with him, and was well aware of Gabby's physical attraction to the vampire. Gabby wasn't easy to read on that score, unless you knew her particularly well, or had supernatural senses. He had both. He spoke without changing the direction of his gaze. He looked straight into Julius's soul-swallowing eyes. "If you hurt her, I'll be forced to make you bleed," he said with a calm matter-of-factness. Julius was silent for 2 heartbeats. There was no question he knew who Carl was referring to. "You love her," the vampire stated. "I understand that. I've always known the best match for her would be a supernatural," Carl tried to explain. "It's always been hard of her to hide her non-human side. She couldn't keep it up in a one-on-one relationship, not and still be happy. She manages it in her business, but even then it takes a toll on her. She has to be careful in so many ways. At least her gift with animals, though generally seen as remarkable, is never suspected by humans to be anything supernatural." He paused for a moment, lost in thought, but then continued. But I guess I always thought of her with a werewolf or shapeshifter. Probably a magus if she could find a really tough one, he said with a slight lift of his lips. I've never considered her with a vampire. I know that probably sounds terribly prejudiced, but we just haven't met any vampires to actually form a relationship with. He finally looked away from Julius's gaze. The more I think about it, the more it begins to make sense. You understand her in many ways better than anyone else does, even me. Her closest friend for nearly half her life. I realise now that she has more in common with vampire nature than either of us ever thought possible. It was Julius's turn to look away now, and he looked down as though studying his hands. You understand just fine. The two of you would make the perfect couple. Have you ever considered that? He asked, still looking at his hands. Carl actually barked a short laugh. Yeah, the idea certainly did occur to us, Carl acknowledged. Definitely seemed like the perfect solution for both of us. When she turned 17, we gave it a shot. He felt his eyes go distant, remembering. We can't make chemistry work by ordering it to. If it's not there, it's just not there. For me, it was there. She's not exactly unattractive after all. But Gabby just couldn't get into it. I think I was too much like a big brother to her. Too familiar. He snorted now. And with senses like ours, you can't even fake it, can you? Julius nodded ruefully in agreement, looking up now but staying silent, allowing Kyle to continue his disclosure. Anyhow, after a couple of tries we gave up and decided the sibling relationship worked best for us. So we rib each other about our romantic flings and help each other pick up the pieces when things fall apart. I've never seen her lose her heart, though. She never makes herself that emotionally vulnerable to anyone. She's seen her mother go through losing her father, and then she watched her mother nearly make a catastrophic mistake with a violent boyfriend. You're the first person I would be worried about truly hurting her emotionally, because I can see that she's becoming emotionally entangled with you already. As a man who cares deeply about her, I ask you to think carefully about becoming more involved with her. If you're not serious about her, you need to distance yourself from her now, before she gets in so deep that she can't untangle herself. He said the last bit in a deadpan rush. He didn't relish taking on the stern big brother role, but he'd do just about anything to protect her. He also knew that if she found out about this conversation, they'd both be bleeding. Julius finally spoke. I'm not a magus, so I don't like to make predictions about the future, and I have no idea whether it can actually work between me and Gabrielle. But I can assure you that I have her best interest at heart. I find myself feeling extraordinarily protective of her, but not in a brotherly kind of way, he said with a slight smile. If anyone else tries to hurt her, I would rip their throat out without a second thought, so I understand your feelings on the matter. I'd expect nothing less from you if I were to hurt her myself. There was silence in the space as Carl tipped his head in acknowledgement of Julius's statement. Tell me about her mother's violent boyfriend. I was under the impression her mother was happily remarried, Julius asked, steering the conversation away from the original topic. She is happily remarried now, at least. The guy's very pleasant and comes from a line of shapeshifters, but isn't a shifter himself. So at least her mum doesn't have to cover up for Gabby all the time. Makes it easier for Gabby and her mum that way. The violent boyfriend came when Gabby was still in school. I guess it would help you understand the story if you have a bit more background to it. I'm going to vehemently deny ever telling you this if she finds out that you know about it, though. When Julius nodded his acceptance of the conditions, Carl continued. Gabby was only 10 when her dad was killed. Her mum went into a serious depression and was almost catatonic for weeks afterwards. Byron and his wife helped look after Gabby and cover things up from social services. If the social workers had any idea how bad it actually had been, they would have hospitalized her mum and put Gabby in foster care. Anyhow, they eventually managed to get her into medication. She was able to function almost normally. But a lot of the household responsibility fell on Gabby's shoulders. She had to grow up fast, and in a way the mother-child relationship became almost reversed. Gabby felt responsible for her mum, and although their relationship wasn't exactly plain sailing, she was very protective of her mother. I guess we also have that in common, he mused half to himself. Several years later, her mum met a man in the local bookstore, and they began dating. When I met Gabby, the man was pushing to move into the house with them. Gabby was dead set against it. She had some sixth sense about this guy. She didn't trust him or like him one bit. I have to admit, at the time, I felt it was simply the fact that she didn't want her dad replaced. Perfectly understandable under the circumstances. The only reason her mum hadn't let the man moved in was because he was full human. She wasn't sure how he'd react to Gabby's supernatural abilities, which would become obvious once he spent enough time around her. He gave a brief snort of laughter. Gabby absolutely delighted in giving him a hard time. She'd even asked me for ideas on how to annoy him further. She mouthed off to him at every chance she got. She pushed every one of his buttons and was rude and obnoxious every time her mum was out of earshot. She even encouraged her gazillion pets to give him a hard time. They'd bite him, peck him, shit on him, trip him up, scare him. Julius echoed Carl's smile, as though he too could picture the scene of a young, short-tempered, foul-mouthed Gabby trying her damnedest to annoy a human without giving herself away. Carl continued, but though she did seem to get to him, none of her efforts actually deterred him. I think now that she may have been spot on with her idea that he was only there to get his hands on a large inheritance her dad had left for the two of them. A few months later, he was becoming increasingly insistent that he should move in with them, bringing up news reports about house burglaries and crime in the area, and how they needed him to protect them. Gabby thought her mum was close to cracking, but she got home early from school one day to hear them arguing in the house. This ignorant arsehole was screaming and hurling verbal abuse at her mum. Gabby opened the door on the scene and saw her mum standing across the room with a terrified expression. She had a puffy red mark across her face and blood trickled out the corners of her mouth. He noticed Julius's fist clench. She didn't even hesitate, Carl said with all the gloating of a proud big brother. She walked straight to the hall closet and took out her father's 9-iron. He felt a dark, humid smile crease his face. She never described much of the scene to me. I don't think she remembers much of it, but I can picture his cockily confident face as she approached him. He would have been thinking he was quickly going to take that golf club away from her dainty little 14-year-old and put her in her place at long last. He could never have imagined how she was about to let loose on him with it. He saw Julius's hands relax from their tendon straining clench. Her mother finally managed to pull Gabby off him. He was still alive at that point, but just barely. They called Byron, not wanting to involve the police and not knowing what else to do. He arrived quickly and threw the man in his car and helped them clean up the mess in the house, and told them they'd never have to worry about that man again. For Gabby, that was the end of the story. Her mother was far more cautious about going out with men after that, and Gabby for a time had a severe distrust of all men. What happened to the boyfriend? Julius asked calmly, and without apparent interest, but not fooling Carl in the slightest. Gabby has still never asked Byron what happened to him, and claims she doesn't want to know. But I asked him one day. I wanted to be sure that he could never try to reappear in their lives, or that's what I told Byron anyway. His expression turned chagrined. Obviously didn't fool him, because he wouldn't tell me anything beyond that the man's memories had been wiped, and he would never get the chance to hurt another woman again. I'm guessing he was made the scapegoat for various crimes, made a full Magi-induced confession to the police, and is now serving a long prison sentence somewhere in the world. Julius's eyebrows rose in surprise. Carl chuckled. Don't forget that Byron is at least as protective of Gabby as I am, and he's a downright crafty old fox when he comes down to it. Don't ever make the mistake of underestimating him. Rory's voice crackled over the intercom as the van engines cut off. We're here, guys. It didn't take them long to unload the humans and leave them in the capable hands of a group of dedicated Magi healers. Gabby was secretly very relieved that the woman who'd staked her was under heavy sedation, mainly because she continued to react with violence towards anyone who came near her, but the rest of them gave no trouble, following orders with numb obedience. She was intensely glad to be done with the part of the evening's work. They quickly split up into 3 groups as planned. This time Julius joined Gabby's team and Alex took up his habitual position alongside Julius. Fergus and Nathan had a brief silent squabble about which of them would be the 4th member of Gabby's team, and it was Nathan who backed down at the end and joined Lance along with Marcello and Matt, who were still trying to get used to the idea of working with vampires. Carl's team consisted of Charles and Quinton, who'd both fought with them at the train station, and a vampire Gabby recognised as the dark-complexioned vampire from the bar a few nights ago. His name was Tabari. Alexander had told her, explaining that Tabari was something of a rarity in vampire society, being of black African descent. For some reason, Alexander didn't know exactly why. There was very few black vampires in existence. The paleness of vampirism sat strangely on him, turning his skin to a dusty ashen hue. When he spoke, his fangs were unashamedly visible, and his accent was strong enough to bring Gabby vivid memories of her time in South Africa. Kyle pulled out a map and spread it over the bonnet of the car. They quickly divided the city and its main ley line areas into sectors and chose their sectors. They agreed to check in with each other every hour, then piled into cars and vans and headed out on patrol. Gabby's Mustang had been left at the warehouse, so she knew she'd have to join Julius in his car. This time he'd arrived in a less conspicuous Audi. A quick glance from Julius had sent Alexander and Fergus to join the driver and medic in one of the SMV vans, especially equipped with weapons and medical supplies. The tension in the car when she climbed in was almost palpable. Julius was obviously not comfortable around her. She was fairly certain he would have noticed that she took a shower before leaving this morning, which should have told him that she hadn't bolted like a startled lamb when she woke up and found him comatose next to her. Probably even knew that she and Carl had stayed long enough to have breakfast before they left the state. She wondered why he still seemed so tense. Was he regretting what happened last night? She couldn't stand the silence a moment longer. "I feel like I owe you an apology," she said, breaking the silence first. "What?" he asked, shock clear in his tone. "Well," she swallowed, I didn't give you much choice in the matter last night. I should have controlled myself a little better." She looked down at her hands, trying to make herself unclench her fists. Julius let out a loud, masculine laugh, the tension in the car dissipating in an instant. He looked at her sidelong with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "And I was fending you off with a barge pole," he retorted. He caught her chin with his fingers, not bothering to pay attention to the road, and tilted her face to look at him. "It was an amazing night," he said in a deep purr, ensnaring her eyes with his. Then he sighed and broke her gaze. "Can we save this conversation for later?" he asked, sounding regretful. "If we start talking about it now, I'm not going to be able to concentrate on the task at hand." He ran the back of his fingers softly down her cheek as he withdrew his hand. "Perhaps we can discuss it at your house after we finish here." Gabby felt a rush of sensation flood her. She had to clamp down hard on her self-control. "I might owe you another apology tomorrow if we do that," she warned him, trying to keep the blush from her cheeks. A slow, pleased smile lifted the side of his face that she could see, and the tiniest hint of dimple appearing as he tried to keep the smile from becoming a smirk. And then their conversation was brought to an end. They arrived at their first ley line convergence. See you next week. Bye, guys.